Well, now I don't know remember the exact year that this took place, but I can tell you it took place somewhere in the middle 30s because we still lived at Paradise, and we moved from Paradise to Tucson in 38. So that was before that. Well, I'd been up in New Mexico, and Clell was working for the government, visiting. And there close to that ranch, well, we needed another saddle animal, so we borrowed this mule, Budwiser. And this happened, and I later bought him and took him home. Well, he wasn't in very good shape, and Vincent and I was back in there, and Clell wasn't with us, and Clell was hunting for the government, and he went to town after supplies, and Vincent and I went out, and I was riding this Budwiser mule. Well, we came up on a point right at the forks of a canyon, and it was steep, and it must have been 200 yards to the bottom of that point. And as I rode out there and started down, my britchen, now that's what holds your saddle back to keep it from slipping over a mule's shoulders onto his neck and over his head. Well, my britchen kind of give some way, and that saddle scooted up on that mule, and he just jumped right straight out in the air. And boy, what I mean, he started jumping off of that mountain, and when he'd go up, I could look way down to the bottom of it. And I knew we could never get to the bottom of that mountain like that. And of course, that saddle had kind of tipped up, and that back end of that cantle was a hitting me and pushing me forward all the time, and the fourth or fifth jump, off I went. And I just rolled off of that mountain, and I was really rolling, and I rolled by a big rock, and I reached out my right arm and caught that rock, and it nearly jerked, I felt like it nearly jerked my arm out of socket, and I finally got stopped up in a sitting position. And Vincent was right behind me, and he jumped off of his saddle animal and said, don't try to get up. He said, if you're not broke all to pieces, you ought to be. And the blood was running out of my mouth, and I was so numb that I didn't know whether I was hurt or not. And I didn't know whether I had any teeth left or not. So I took my finger and put all in my mouth and felt of all my teeth and just had one broke off. And I said, well, but my lips is cut. The upper and lower lips both is cut where they'd hit a rock. And all the blood is just running. And so then I worked both legs and both arms. And I said, well, Benson, I don't believe I'm broke up. And so I got up. And when I got up, I went blind. All my head started whirling. I went blind, so I just sat back down. And I sat there for quite a few minutes. But I don't remember how long, but I'll bet I sat there for at least 15, 20 minutes, maybe longer. And kind of worked myself around a little bit. And finally I got up, and this mule had just bucked around there and stopped. Well, we called him and went on and led him to the bottom of that ridge. And I walked and got down there, and we fixed my saddle, and I got on. Well, the next day, I was sore. I could no more turn my head than the man in the moon. And every time I took a breath, it really hurt in my ribs. But in a few days, well, I don't remember just how long, but within a week, well, I was riding again, and I never even went to the doctor. And later on, I got hurt by a horse, and 3 ribs broke on one side. And went to the hospital. Well, as they took those x-rays, the doctor come in and said, when did you get those ribs broke on the other side? I said, how many is broke? He said, there's 4 ribs broke. And he said, one of those ribs are lapped, but they've grown together, but they're lapped over. And I said, Ol Budwiser done that. Not after Budwiser was already gone. Not too many years ago that horse hurt me. And he also hurt me in the back. And I really haven't got over that back hurt and never will. But anyway, well, when I went home, I wrote back up to that fellow that owned Ol Budwiser, and I bought him and went and hauled him home to Paradise. Well, he wasn't in good shape, so I let him out on good feed and didn't put my saddle on him for about a month. And by that time, he was rolling fat and he was really feeling good. So I had a pair of big Chihuahua spurs. If you know what a Chihuahua is, the rowels are probably around 3.5 inches from point to point, in short shank, but long, but big rowels. And I had a pair of them. And so I told him, I said, if Ol Budwiser ever bucks with me again, I'm going to spur him in the point of the shoulder and plumb back to his hips every time he hits the ground at these old Chihuahuas. Well, I rode him for quite a few days and put some good rides on him. He never offered to buck. So then there was a ranch over there that was in a real good line country that was on the west side of the mountain. And I thought that I knew the people well that owned it. Had stayed there before. So I told my folks there, I said, well, I'm going to get on Ol Budwiser and hunt across that mountain and stay at that Baldridge Ranch. And for 2 or 3 days, and then I'm going to hunt back. And I took 7 or 8 hounds with me. Well, when I hit the top of the mountain, well, I hit a bobcat track. And I trailed it for a long ways and for quite a while. Never did jump the bobcat, so I got him and started down this, what they call Rock Creek, that went back down to this ranch. And it was, the head of it is way up in the tops of the cherry cows. So it was real late in the evening, almost dusk. And I started down to cross the creek, a little stream running there. And there was a stick laying there, kind of in the shape of a rocking chair. Well, of course, I never paid any attention to that stick. Well, that mule stepped on one end of that stick, and it flew up and hit that mule in the stomach, and he just exploded. Well, he jumped plumb across that. He was kind of in the edge of the water, and he jumped plumb across that stream and hit, and he was right in the trail. And when he did, I just sucked them Chihuahuas right up in his shoulders. And he made about 3 more jumps, and the lights went out for me. Now, until later, I didn't know what had happened. And then he wheeled and bucked 4 or 5 jumps back into the creek and come to some real slick rocks that the water had run over, and that mule knew he couldn't jump out on them rocks, onto that rock and hold his footing. And he just turned around and came back out, which was several steps from the trail. And instead of turning back towards home, he could have turned any direction. He turned down this trail that I was riding down when he started bucking. And of course, I don't know how long the time had elapsed, but anyway, it was at least a mile from there. I came to and was sitting on that mule, and it was just real dark. And I just said, whoa, and stopped. Oh, my head did hurt. So I felt up there, and all the side of my face right down by my eye and onto my cheek, and about halfway down, all the hide was knocked off of it. And it really did hurt. And then my left wrist. Hurt so bad I thought it was broke, but it wasn't. And I couldn't remember there for a little while anything. I just had to sit there, and I sat there for quite a spell, of course. I don't know just how long, till I finally could remember leaving home. And then I remembered coming on the mountain and trailing that bobcat. And then I remembered then finally to where Ol Budwiser started bucking. So, of course, I knew the country like a book, and he had missed the trail that I wanted to go down. And this, when I came to, I was really on an old road. And I wanted to go on down there'd been an old logging road years before. I wanted to go on down this canyon to that ranch, which now that ranch was at least 3 to 3.5 miles right straight on down that rock creek. And so I finally located just where I was. Now I looked back and I've seen some bluffs in the dark that I recognized, and they were called Mason Bluffs, and named after a fellow after we were there that Ernest had lion hunting and killed a lion in those bluffs, and his name was Mason. And so those bluffs became known as the Mason Bluffs. Well, I turned around and rode back to the trail that took on down the creek, and found it all right, and on down the creek I went, and I come to a gate. Well, you know, when I went to get off that gate, my right leg wouldn't work. I couldn't lift it over the saddle. So I knew I had to get through that gate. And now, folks, I had to put all the willpower that I had together to keep from just getting off there and just laying down and going to sleep. Oh, I was sleepy. And I couldn't. And I knew good and well that if I did, and it was getting pretty cold there at night, I just knew if I did, that'd be my last sleep. So I got him up close to a rock, and I took my left leg out of the stirrup and got it on that rock. And then I took my right leg in both hands, and I finally got it off of that saddle. Well, I put my weight on it, and I saw that it wasn't broke. But the muscles in the front of my right leg, way up above my knees, were tore so that I could step with my left leg and drag my right one, but I couldn't put it forwards one bit. Well, I finally managed to get the gate open. Then I got him up close to a stump. And he just stood there just as nice as a mule could. And I finally, with my left leg, I could get up on that stump. So I took my hands and just put my right leg over the saddle and just slid into the saddle. And on down the canyon we went. And I had all my 8 hounds, or I'd counted them. They was all right with me. And I made them stay back. I didn't want no hunting and no running. And on down the creek I went. Well, I finally got in the light of that ranch house, and I found another gate. So I saw a light there, and I hollered. And a fellow came out and answered me. And I hollered to him, said, "Would you come over and open this gate?" He said, "Well, sure." So he walked up there. I imagine a couple of 100 yards, maybe 250, somewhere in that neighborhood. And as he opened the gate and I rode through, he said, "Well, I thought you was driving a bunch of animals or something." Says, "Why did you call me over here to open this gate?" And I didn't even know him. That ranch had changed hands, and these new owners had been there about a month. And I didn't even know that the new people was there, and I didn't know them at all. So I explained to him. I said, "Well, now listen. if I was in the shape that you're in, and you're in the shape that I'm in, I wouldn't have minded walking that 200 yards to open this gate for you at all. So he struck a match and looked at me, and he said, say, your head looks bad. I said, well, it's not only my head, but it's my left arm and my right leg. And I said, by golly, I'm hurt. Well, he said, that's different then. Come on over. So we went on over to the house, and he was just a working for this fellow. This fellow was named Bill Baldridge that had bought it, and he was a working in Douglas and had bought this ranch, and his wife was there. And he'd come about every weekend or something like that. And I didn't know them either. Then I learned to know them and hunted from there many times later. Well, come to find out, she was a registered nurse. Well, we got up in front of the house, and this old boy helped me off of my mule, and then helped me in the house. And then he took my dogs and tied them up and took care of them. And I wanted to go to sleep. And I hurt so bad, I wanted to go to sleep anyway. I guess it was shock, I think. That's what they called it. But anyway, well, she went to putting hot towels on my head, in my wrist, and my leg. As I told you, she was a registered nurse. And she put me right to bed, and it wasn't very long till I was asleep. Well, the next morning, I was so stiff and so sore I couldn't get out of that bed to save my neck. So I just laid there. And she took care of me. Then the next day, well, I stayed in bed too, but I got up a little that day. And the next day I told that fellow, I said, I've got to go home. Well, he said, you can't go back across that mountain on that mule. I said, I got to. It's not canna. I said, I got to. I said, now I told my folks I would come over here and I was going to hunt 2 days and then I'd come back the next day. Well, I said, my 2 days of hunting is already up. So I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. You saddle up my mule for me in the morning, and if you will, and turn loose my dogs, and then you get on your saddle horse, and you help me through the first 2 gates up here. And I said, then I'll be plumb across the mountain before I hit another gate. No, I'll be plumb on top of the mountain before I hit the first gate. Well, he says, I hate to see you do that. I said, well, I got to. And I said, I got no way to get them word. There's no telephones around here. No telephone there at Paradise. So he did. He helped me up. The last gate he helped me up there was that one where I first noticed that my leg was hurt so bad. Of course, he opened and closed the gates for me, and I said, so long, I'll make it to Paradise. Well, that is an awful trip across there. And every time I hit a gate, well, I had to get my left leg on something and then lift my right leg over and then close the gate and then do the same thing. But I could stand on that leg, but I couldn't make it go forward at all. So I went home. I got there. And of course, I was just all in and went right to bed, and my mother was really mad. She said, that's twice that mule has hurt you. And said, now I have a good notion to just take that mule down there and shoot him right between the eyes. And I said, well, Mother, he's an awful good mule. She said, yeah, he's good. He's hurt you before, and now he's hurt you again. So it was a long, hard trip, but the second day after that, I went to the doctor in Douglas, and he looked at my arm and said it was sprained, And he looked at my head and said, that is just a bruise, which I knew. And of course, I had all kinds of bandages on my head, and just big scabs coming by that time. And he examined my leg real good, and he said, well, what is wrong? Says those muscles in the front of your leg is tore so that you'll be 2 months before you can put that leg forward at all. And that was terrible. I could walk, but it just rubbed my leg, and I couldn't step forward. And he said, well, you'll be longer getting over that than you would if it's broke. And so that was quite a trip, and that was quite an experience. Okay, this hunt took place in the swamps of Nayarit, Mexico, and it took place about 46 or 47, somewhere in that neighborhood, because it took place after World War II was over, and it ended in 45. And one of our clients there was a Fred Crawford from Everett, Pennsylvania. And he was a man up in years then, and he was starting his big game career. And we were down there before this incident happened, and the dogs were trailing a Jaguar kind of on a hill, but although we were camped in the edge of the swamp. And a big parrot, one of those big macaws that's just got a little red on its head and solid green. Oh, he wanted one of those parrots. He's going to begin to mount trophies. So I've forgotten what he shot it with, but he shot it and didn't kill it, but broke a wing or something. And he went out to pick up that parrot, and that parrot just bit him with his bill right between his thumb and forefinger, and just bit plumb through. And then grabbed him by the claws with his other hand. And he come a-carrying that parrot over there and says, doggone, says, I believe these parrots are more vicious than the Jaguars. Anyway, we finally got him loose. And so then we took him down in those swamps, and they were bad. So he come to me and he said, I sure want a Jaguar trophy to take home, but he says, I don't want to go down in them swamps after it. You get me one and I'll take it home. And I said, well, I'll do my best, but I'd like for you to go. No, I want to stay here and not hold you back so you can get me a good specimen of a Jaguar. So then here was a young Mexican that was only 19, 20 years old. He is working for us. And he said, say, listen, he said, right down here at one place at this same time last year, we heard seven Jaguars roaring at one time, one night. I said, how do you know it's seven? He said, well, there's in 7 different locations. I said, well, that's too many. If we can get one to roar, well, that's all I want. So I said, how about you going with me, and we'll, just you and I, and we'll take a pack of dogs down there and take enough to last us a couple of days. Food for us and the dogs, and that big old dugout boat that we had rented there that was just made out of a huge tree, and it is pretty long and would haul a lot of stuff. And he said, well, I'll go with you. So I said, well, how long will it take us to get down there? Well, he said, I imagine me having to pole and push and paddle that boat. He said, I imagine it'll take us 6 hours just going right straight to it. I said, okay. just between sundown and dark. That was about noon. I said, let's get ready. And between sundown and dark, let's leave here. And I said, I'll call all the way down. He said, all right. So we did. Now, they had to cut certain kind of poles to push, kind of crooked with a certain bend on the end. And it had to be, goodness, I guess 20 feet long. And those Mexicans were an expert at pushing them boats. And I could try it, and I'd go just one direction and then the other. Of course, I'd never done that in my life. So he had to do, well, he did do all the poling and all the paddling, as far as I was concerned. Because when you hit deep water, then you have to paddle it. And we had a big old paddle in there. So we loaded our stuff and put it in sacks and wrapped it in canvas and put it in our boats, and then we took 6 hounds. And we just turned them loose in the boat. And we started out. Well, now this shows you how sound will carry over that level country and lots of it water. We got away down there from camp, and it just got dark good, and I heard music. And I kept listening, and I could hear that music. Well, I couldn't figure where that music was coming from. So I asked him, I said, where's that music coming from? He said, well, from Pericos. That was a little old town that was the nearest to our camp, and that's where he lived. Now, these Mexicans will take a radio right out on the streets and then just let them blare just as loud as they will blare. And that's what it was. I said, well, we must be 6 miles from Pericos. He said, well, we're a good long ways. But everything real quiet, and it's dark, just getting good dark, well, you can sure hear it. So we just kept paddling. We'd hit in deep water then and paddling along, of course, going slow. And I was sitting up in the bow of the boat, and I was using a horn then instead of a gourd. And I would call every once in a while. And finally he asked me, says, have you ever had a Jaguar answer that horn? Now, see, this is one of the first trips I'd ever made down there. Said, well, it was the first. It wasn't the first Jaguars we'd caught in there. This wasn't the first hunting party, but it was the first season. And I said, well, I haven't been calling here very much. I said, the old man, Don Cherma's been doing the calling, but I didn't want to bring him down here. I wanted us to do it. And I said, I've had Jaguars to answer me up north. He said, well, you know, says, I don't believe that sounds too much like a Jaguar. And I don't believe these here will answer that call. I said, well, maybe they won't. So we just kept paddling, though. And I imagine 30 minutes later, or maybe longer than that. No, I guess it's probably an hour later. Maybe an hour and a half, quite a while later. Well, I called, and we heard one off to our left. And the first time this thing answered, you could hear it good. And oh boy, now that little boy really got excited. He said, that's a big male. And I know good and well he couldn't tell. But I didn't say anything. He said, now, you roar like a female, and says that thing will come right to us. I kind of sniggered. And so in a little bit, I just cut down on a call. Didn't change my call one bit. And this is the way imagination will work on you. That Jaguar just answered right back. And that old boy said, that sounded just like a female Jaguar, that last call you made. And I didn't change it one particle. So I told him, I said, well, now listen, we got to get to land if that thing's a coming to us. And where can we get off? He said, well, right down there's a real narrow place that we can just get the boat through. But I've been in there by boat, and there's a place in there where we can dock the boat. And I said, well, let's get to it. So we started, and I called just a time or two more, and that thing answered and was coming towards us. So we finally, then one of these hounds jumped out of the boat. Well, I finally got out and all of that mud and stuff and got that dog, and I held his mouth so he couldn't bawl and beller, and I corrected him a little bit and put him back in that boat, and he didn't try to jump out anymore either. And I had quit calling the Jaguar, and he was roaring just every little bit, still coming towards us, and he was trying to get me to answer him, and I wouldn't do it. I kept telling this boy, come on, get this thing pushed through here, and let's get to where we can dock this boat and get out and take our dogs out. And he said, well, it's just a little ways on down here. So after a bit, well, we got there. So we tied our boat up. We took the dogs out and took them back. And here was a little opening right next to there that wasn't jungle, but it was real muddy around the edges and water in the middle of it. And so we took them back into the jungle and tied them up. And it was on wet ground, but they just laid down and went to sleep. Real muddy around the edges and water in the middle of it. And so we took them back into the jungle and tied them up. And it was on wet ground, but they just laid down and went to sleep. These hounds did. They paid no attention to that calling because I called around them all the time and I didn't want them to pay any attention. And during this time, that Jaguar kept a roaring every little bit. And we finally got all ready. And so I walked down, not over 20 yards, 25, from where the hounds was, and I left this Mexican boy there. And I just squatted down on my heels because it was mud there to sit down. And I called. And boy, he just answered right back, and you could tell he wasn't too far off. And now in a minute, I heard a crackling and looked back there, and this old boy built a fire. And I jumped up and run back there and stomped it into the mud. And I said, we'll come down here to call the Jaguar up, and then you build a fire. He said, well, I'm cold. I said, well, by golly, you can't be too cold. And I said, you come with me. That was a bad thing. But I made him go with me, and we walked back down there right to where I'd been squatted down, so we both squatted down. And I called, and that thing answered right off, and he was closer. So we waited there a little while. I called again, nothing. After a little bit, I called again, no answer. And now all of this time is about midnight. And all right, I waited a while, I called again. No answer. I said, then I thought he got suspicious and probably turned back or went around us or done something. And so we had just squatting there. And way down there, quite a little ways from us, and around just a little point of this jungle that come right around the edge of that, right next to this string of water we had tied up on, we heard him a-walking. And you could hear him walking pretty plain. And these hounds laying back there didn't know there was anything taking place, and they never winded him or anything. And now in a minute, this was, the moon is shining, but real pale. But you could see him real plain. He just stepped around, kind of around them bushes where we couldn't see him, and started right to us. And when he did, that old kid just started to get up, and I reached over and caught him to my right and grabbed him by the arm and said, "Stay still, stay still." Whispered to him. And he's going to get up anyway. So I turned him loose and he jumped up. And he had a flashlight and I had one. And he shined that light at him and turned and run back to the dogs. And they was tied. And I just squatted there and he just stood there with his head held high and looking at us. And I decided that I'd take a shot at him in that light. So I just eased I had a 30-30 and no bullet in the barrel. Well, I just eased that Winchester. I just eased that lever down, and when it clicked, well, he just turned and run across that opening right in front of us, and he is making big jumps. Well, I didn't shoot at him because I knew I didn't have any show of hitting him, and I just thought maybe it might make him run faster or do something. So I just jumped up and turned around and run back to those hounds, and we had them tied with little ropes and no collars on them. And I just took my pocket knife and just cut them little old ropes off of them just fast as I could. Well, 6 of them, now that didn't take long. Then I just grabbed my gun and had my flashlight and started running down through there. And these hounds, they weren't excited. And I was wanting them to get a little pep into them. And one of them stopped to go to the bathroom, and I run over him and nearly fell down. And when we hit where that thing had run across that flat, now they come to life because they all bawled and bellered and barked, and they left there on high gear, and us after them with our flashlights. Well, we didn't go far till we hit a good stringer of water. And this boy was probably 20, 30 feet to one side of me, and he crossed it. He is ahead of me, and he crossed that water. And I hit that water, and it just started getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And finally, I was holding my gun and flashlight plumb up over my head, and it come right to the pit of my arm. And I thought maybe I was going to have to swim. So he was already out on the bank, and I told him, I said, "You be sure and hang on to that flashlight. Because if I have to swim, I'm going to try to bring my rifle across, but I'll throw this flashlight down." But I got across, and then away we went. Well, we heard him, and that thing must have run at least, seemed to me like a good mile before they ever bait him. And the dogs caught him, and he wouldn't climb a tree. He bait on the ground. And we could hear them fighting him, and the hounds are screaming and all that. So, of course, we was hurrying as fast as we could. And it wasn't long till we was right there. Well, we came up on 2 hounds. One of them was a little old red hound, and the other one was an old hound we got out of California that was an English. And they just stand there barking. Well, the Jaguar was in there 40 feet from them. And there was only 2 dogs with him. So we started slipping into those other dogs and just passed these. And they didn't go on with us either. They just stood there because they were scared. And we got right up to what these trees are. The tree starts out, and then from away up there, and little bitty roots hang down. And it shows how deep that water does get by how high it is where the tree starts. Because these roots will just keep hanging down and just form, they're as big around, some of them is a broom stick. And this thing was bait in one of them. And when we got right close to him, not a minute, here comes one of these hounds. I called him Deuce. He was a light-colored blue tick. And he come around from the opposite side and just made a circle out there. And he wasn't a barking or a howling. That dog was a screaming, the most pitiful screams you ever heard. And I thought, well, boy, he's gone. And that leaves me only one hound because them other two are not here. Because those two back there wasn't going to do me any good. And you know, that dog just circled around out there and come back. And into there he went and went to be in that Jaguar right close. Well, this other English dog that was called Rowdy, now he had blue tick body and red tick legs and a tan head. He was just staying right in there. And we come right up to where that thing is bayed and shined the light in there and saw just a little spot. And so, by golly, this old kid had never killed a jaguar in his life, and I'd killed him. So I just handed him the gun and held that light in there, and I said, shoot him. We didn't know what part of him it was. And he shot in there, and right in the middle of that opening, which wasn't any bigger than a baseball, and I guess hit right about in the middle of it. And that jaguar just made 2 or 3 jumps and come out on the other side and fell dead. He hit him right behind the shoulders, right? Just tore his lungs all to pieces. And boy, these other 2 dogs came in, and these dogs was chewing on that jaguar, and we went around there and looked at it. And this other English dog was called Rowdy. He would look at me and chew on that jaguar and wiggle his tail. And boy, he had the most pitiful looking head that you ever saw. Oh, he was tore up. Had one big gash right straight across his head, and his jaws and nose. Oh, and he was ripped up. But he had just tickled. He just chewed on that jaguar and wiggled his tail and looked at me. Then he got that jaguar by the ear, and I had to get him loose. Because if I'd left him there, he'd have ruined that trophy and have chewed that jaguar's ears off. And I knew that, because I'd run bear with him, and he'd do that to a bear if I didn't make him get back. So then, that was about 2 o'clock that night. So I told that old boy, I said, okay, you go back to the boat, and I'll drag this thing along, and it's going to take me a long time to drag it out. But I said, it won't hurt to hide a bit in this mud and water and stuff. And you go back to the boat and take a look for those other hounds. And so I was still a-pulling and a-tugging and moving along a little bit, and it went to getting daylight. So after I figured I was pretty close to where we left the boat, I hollered, and that old kid answered me. And he said, here's these other 2 hounds, they're here at camp. And I said, well, what's the matter with them? He said, well, they're tore up. And I said, all right. I said, tie them up. I said, can you bring that boat around anyway and get to me at this next stringer of water? That'd be the stringer of water that I crossed that night. He said, yeah, I can go down a ways and then come back up and pick you up. I said, well, you do that. And by the time you get here, well, I'll be to the edge of that water with this jaguar. And of course, I had the other 4 hounds with me. So he did, and we loaded that jaguar up and then went back down and back up to where we had our camp. Took our dogs out and tied them and give them something to eat. Then we got something to eat for ourselves that we had there. And so we loaded that boat up then, and we started back to camp. And so I took this big old jaguar and put him under there. Had already gutted him before I ever started to drag him out. Put him in this old boat, and of course it's pretty hot weather down there. And you can't leave those hides on them too long, or you'll ruin your hide. So I covered him up with this old tarp good, and so he'd stay as cool as possible, and we started. Of course, I we come back faster than we went because I was hurrying that old boy all the way. Well, late that afternoon, we was coming into camp, and so I just took that old horn and I was just hollering through it. I wasn't calling the Jaguar or anything. And of course, they heard it at camp, and they was standing there on the bank, and this old fellow that wanted that Jaguar so bad said, my brother there, and he was a cooking for us, Benson, said, do you reckon they got a Jaguar? Well, Benson said, I imagine that they have, or he wouldn't be hollering through that horn. And of course, these dogs weren't tied. They was in there. And when we pushed it up against the bank there, and one of these other Mexicans jumped down there and got the rope and tied it, I said, well, boys, take a look at them. I said, you can tell by looking at this pack of hounds that something's happened. Now, there was 4 of them that is really tore up. And this English dog, oh, he was horrible. And that was before the days of penicillin, but we did have this sulfur powder. And I'd had some of that with me, of course. I'd put that all in him. But coming up there that day, I saw him a panting, and I looked down by the side of his jaw. I think it was on the left side, and saw a big hole right next to his jaw. And I pulled his lips out and stuck my finger in there, and I could just stick my finger way down in the hole that didn't even show on the outside of his mouth. And oh, he is in tough shape. Well, we took him out, and they said, yeah, we can tell by looking at him, something's happened. Well, I said, fellas, it's a sad story because he got away. And I was just looking right straight at this client, and boy, the disappointment come over his face. So I said, oh, by the way, I'm going to let you take a look at some little old animal here that we did finally manage to get. And I throwed that tarp back, and that big spotted son of a gun was laying there, and he was a beautiful animal, and we washed him all off and all. And I was still looking at this guy, and when he saw that Jaguar, the expression turned from disappointment or something to real satisfaction when he looked at that trophy. Now that was a good hunt for game, but I sure hated to see those dogs tore up like they were. Well, the next day, that poor dog, old Rowdy, I called him, that English dog, head was swelled so that his head was at least twice as big as it ought to be, and his eyes were swelled so that he couldn't see one wink out of either eye. And it took quite a while for him to ever so he could see to get around. Well, now see that in the hot country down there, and those Jaguar claws and their teeth are real infectious. They are really put infection into any gas that you can get. Now, a dog doesn't get infected anything like a man, so you can figure what they could do to a man even if they mauled him and clawed him. He'd be lucky, just like in Africa when a man gets mauled by those lions, of surviving just the infection. And that's just the same way it is down there. And so in the days of penicillin, I always take lots of penicillin with me. And when I get a dog tore up, I start shooting him right then with penicillin. And penicillin has really been a blessing to anybody hunting down in that country. Now, when you're training big game hounds, there are several things that you should and should not do. Now, this is one thing that you should not do. You should not overhandle your hounds. Now, what I mean by overhandling them is do not be so severe on them that when they're out there in the woods and you're hunting them and trying to catch something with them, that they're afraid of you and that they're more or less afraid to run anything and afraid of you. Now, you shouldn't have your dogs afraid of you, but you should have good control of them. And if you're training big game hounds, you should be sure that that dog knows its name. Now, in your pack of hounds, you shouldn't have too many dogs that have the same sounding name. So if you speak to one dog or one hound, that is the dog that answers and not all the rest of them at the same time. And that helps a lot if you speaking to one dog and it minds and handles and the others don't pay any attention to it. And do not have your hounds afraid of you and afraid to perform, because you will not get the potentials out of them, and sometimes you might get him to where he wouldn't run anything. Now, when you're out there hunting and you have a client that is paying you $2,000 for a 10-day hunt, and your hound is over a couple of big 2 or 3 big ridges from you and in a deep canyon and treed, and you'll never know it and never hear him and never find that dog, well, naturally that makes your client very unhappy. And to be a successful big game hunter, you want your clients happy and satisfied, or you will not make a go of a big game guide and a hunter of hounds. Now, what I mean by that, when you're out there, don't let them range away from you. Have those hounds to where they will hunt, but they will probably not get off to the side or up in front of you much over 100 yards, not over 200 at the most. But about 100 yards is a pretty good distance. And if they're working off to the sides and then in front of you for 100 yards, and there's a line comes through the country, you come close to it, you're going to hit its tracks. But now, like you have 3 dogs and one goes north and one goes east and one west, and they'll go for a mile away, well, you're allowed to have 2 or 3 packs. And 2 or 3 dogs are going at the same time, and none of them be able to hear one another. So do not let your dogs range too far when you're big game hunting. Well, when you're big game hunting, you hunt right along with your dogs, and you're always looking for tracks. And I have found tracks that wasn't fresh tracks that the dogs had passed over, and I've showed it to them, and eventually caught that animal that day. Now, when you see a track, I can even put them on a track when I'm sitting on my saddle animal. But I get off my saddle animal, and call these hounds, and I point right to that track. Well, now you want to train your dogs that when you kind of say, here's a track, come here, and point to the ground, they know that you're finding the track and that they'll come and they'll put their nose right where you point. And that is a must to a good trained big game hound. He wants to put his nose where you point your finger and see if he can possibly get any scent right where you're pointing at. And that is a must in big game hunting. Now, when I'm training big game hounds, I do not fire guns around them and keep shooting around those dogs when maybe you might gun shy them by shooting especially big high-powered rifles right around them, and they don't know what's taking place. I train my dogs to a gun. When I come up to a tree and they're treed, and I walk up there with a gun in my hands, those dogs come to me, and when they see me with a gun, and they're really got to turn around and glue their eyes on that animal because they know that I'm going to shoot it out. And I want my dogs trained to a gun. So if I do see an animal and they're off a ways from me and I shoot at them, shoot at the animal, I want them to come to me in high gear because that has happened. And I want my dogs trained to a gun, and I do not shoot around them, and I don't let other people shoot around my dogs. I've had some pretty harsh words with fellas that's always trying to shoot around them when there wasn't anything to shoot at that you wanted them to run. And that is a must as far as I'm concerned. Do not shoot around your dogs unless you're shooting at something that you want them to run. Well, now, I'm not trying to claim that I'm any real smart man, but I'm telling you these things that I have picked up from experience of many years in the woods and in the mountains with my hounds. And it worked on these trips. And that's the reason that I'm telling you these things do and don't, because they have proven through experience, not through hearsay. Now, the Lee brothers have lots of records. And here is one record that I am really proud of. Now, there is one client, Mr. Joseph Shirk of Peru, Indiana, booked 17 hunts with the Lee brothers. And he was successful and got what he went after. 15 out of the 16 hunts. And he never lived to make the 17th one when he was booked. Well, now, when you have this kind of success in handling clients and getting them what they want, well, that means that you will have success in getting clients. Now, with the last hunt that this Mr. Joseph Shirk made with us, he got 4 lines in a 2 weeks hunt. And he got 3 males and 1 female, and 1 male was an extra large male line. And that's, when you do that, that is the best advertising you can get. And you don't have to spend half of what you make on one client trying to get another one, because these big game sports and that you guide for are men that have plenty of money, and they have lots of friends that are sports and talking amongst themselves. Well, that's where you get the good parties, when you are really a successful big game guy. Well, now, when you're going to take these high-powered sportsmen out on hunting trips, it is the best to always do your homework before you ever take them to camp. You go into an area and you scout that area, and you find where the animals are ranging, no matter what you're going to guide for. If you're going to guide for bear, lion, anything that you're guiding for, Jaguar, and all that, you know that that you have animals in the particular area where you're going to hunt. Because if you don't do that before you ever take your clients into camp, you're not going to be a good, successful big game guide. And that is a must that you should do if you're going to be successful. Now, when you're hunting and training dogs for big game dogs, and you're either a big game hunter or a guide, you want to be extremely careful with your hounds not to take anything away from them that is hereditary, like trailing, striking, and treeing. And you want to be extremely careful about that, because if you're not, well, you won't be successful, and they will not produce the game for you that they would if you give them a fair shake and treated them and handled them the way that they should be handled and treated. Don't take out of a hound something that you can't put back.